Resident Evil.
Out of all of Capcom's attempts to spin off the Resi name into all sorts of weird shenanigans, Code Veronica is going to be the most important one and end up as the most mainstream of the Resi spin-offs, even though the game is still bizarre enough to not be in line with the regular entries. Code Veronica is the next game in the timeline to feature Claire Redfield for a second time, continuing on her mission to find her missing brother, which went off the rails pretty much after she found her first lead in Resi 2. Thankfully, unlike that game, Code Veronica is giving Claire a better shake, since she's put into the boots of the main character instead of simply being one of two equal choices. It's not as good a shake as Jill from Resi 3, but she does a good job nonetheless in being a capable survivor, although she doesn't get any real moments of badassery. To see how bad Claire is at trying her hand of being an investigator by herself, Code Veronica starts with Claire being tossed in prison by an unknown organization while she was snooping around this strange island, since she thinks that Chris has been here for whatever reason. Minutes after she arrives, the guard decides to let her out because the obvious thing happened and he's now one of the few survivors of the zombie outbreak. Now that things have gotten truly sideways enough for the graveyard to literally be belching out the first zombie she has to fight, Claire has to find a way out. One that gets slightly tangled as she begins tripping over the corpses of leftover experiment victims. The island had been home to an Umbrella experiment facility because aren't they always, that was majoring in BOW development in kidnapped children and random enemies of the company, also being imprisoned and barely being treated as human beings. Honestly, the whole zombie outbreak thing leaves them a lot better off than how Umbrella was conducting their operation. However, it later turns out that this island was more of an Umbrella side project, as the main antagonist gets revealed to be Alfred Ashford, an alliterative member of the illustrious Ashford clan, one half of the team that back in the day produced Umbrella Incorporated. If Alfred is going to be anything in the game, it's that he is an aristocratic weirdo of the highest caliber. I was actually having trouble following along with the plot because Code Veronica doesn't do subtitles, and his strange inflections and manner of speaking made understanding slightly difficult.
Please try and keep me amused, and do not disappoint me by dying too soon. I so want to enjoy this.
From what I could understand, Alfred has crowned himself king of this island in an ongoing attempt to rebuild the honor of his family name. What he was to me for most of his pitiful existence was just some dumb-looking guy vaguely threatening Claire with a sniper rifle. He's a terrible shot, thankfully enough, and he's smart enough to keep his incapable ass out of the situation most of the time, and having his precious zombies try and kill Claire by themselves half the time. Now that we're starting to enter into true exploration mode after escaping the prison camp, I can introduce you to the other half of this classic Resi double act. Steve Burnside, I believe is his name, is yet another prisoner of Umbrella who miraculously escaped his own death and kind of teams up with Claire throughout the game, but mostly is off doing his own thing until he pops in randomly in cutscenes. You will never team up with Steve in gameplay or be able to control his actions like in Resi 2. He's just kind of there for some reason. Like a haunted armchair. It's part of the reason why I really don't like Steve as a character or a human being. The bigger reason is his overall personality and the choices that he ends up making. Steve's thing is that he pretends to be a badass and tries to be the action hero, but is completely useless in everything he does. For a third of his screen time, Steve just stands in the middle of an altercation and just poses with SMGs at the enemy. He barely shoots the goddamn guns he's given and mostly just stands around. Oh, and of course, there's all the one-liners and constant belief that Claire can't keep her shit together while you got this gormless dickhead spending his time just running around the facility off-screen and accomplishing jack shit. Not even one shit accomplished. Jesus Christ, this guy pisses me off. He's an annoyance, a constant drain on whatever cinematic quality this game was going for, and to top it all off, Capcom wrote him to be slightly pervy as well. Not like actual rapist stuff, but more of that immature perspective on sex, so he thinks that doing pervy things is kind of okay. What I'm really talking about is that scene in between the first and second act where they go down in a cargo plane in Antarctica and crash into Umbrella's mining facility, because that just makes infinite amounts of profit. And while Claire is passed out from the crash, he wakes up first and decides to go in and get an unconscious kiss out of the bargain. While it isn't exactly a point in Capcom's favor, at least this didn't literally come out of left field, since earlier cutscenes showed Steve catching glances at Claire's bum. But this is going on with a character I already didn't like, makes me approach the line of where I'd say fuck it to continuing to survive with this person. With all of their interactions being a contest to out-macho each other, I was surprised that Claire would cry when Steve eventually kicked the bucket, and just couldn't go on with herself without Chris to snap her out of her little stupor. There was so little emotional attachment being shown throughout the entire game with this guy that it's totally unbelievable. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Chris comes in after the second half to be the true second character of Code Veronica. And since I didn't get to play with him in the original game, it is nice to see that Capcom put his first required appearance in the series as a solid write-up job. Chris himself is just a generic action hero dude with very little to differentiate himself from your classic Battlefield or Medal of Honor protagonist, but at least he wears the stereotype on his sleeve and doesn't manage to fuck it up along the way. Chris is dependable, unflappable, resilient, and doesn't get stopped by little things like emotions and getting shot. Since Claire is looking for Chris and got introduced first, Chris is doing the same thing, and so we end up getting that Resi 2 arrangement where Scenario 2 is cleaning up after Scenario 1 fucked up everything, but it's less direct than Resi 2, so Code Veronica doesn't end up screwing over the Scenario 2 player for picking up all the items in Scenario 1. Chris's scenario on the island is more dangerous since half of the island is on fire and all the doors are locked, plus someone let all the zombies out, those cheeky jerks. With the big reveal of being in a more fucked version of Code Veronica, Chris also gets to encounter more of the actual antagonist of the game, Alexia Ashford, Alfred's twin sister. Alexia is the genius villain of the game, who was a main researcher for Umbrella's company at a young age due to her amazing intellect that got her into university at age 11, and was poised to push the inhuman experiments of Umbrella to new heights. However, one of her first spearheaded experiments was to modify the T-virus with insect DNA, and that didn't go over well when she turned her father into a subject because she considered him completely useless. Which is fair to say, because apparently it was with Alexander that their good family name was tarnished in the eyes of Umbrella's upper brass. The experiment failed miserably as Alexander hulked out for 5 minutes and then died, apparently, so Alexia changed her science a bit and decided to experiment on herself. Big surprise. The big change was that she slowed down the mutation progression by hibernating herself in the Antarctic facility for 15 years. Which is why Alfred was spending the first half of the game disguised as Alexia in order to fool himself and the island staff that she was still around and doing things. Oh, yeah, I probably forgot to mention that. Like I was alluding to earlier, Code Veronica is closer to your typical Resi game, but it goes out even further and becomes a really bizarre experience. From Alexia and Alfred being the antagonists and the strange way they have of speaking and looking at the world to the human experiments thing, this is not going to be your typical entry, and then you find Alfred's diary at the top of the mansion, which details, sort of, an incestual love he has towards Alexia, and that's where I gave up trying to understand what the hell was going on. It's not exactly romantic love that he has, and more like godly devotion, but the fact that it's towards his sister and the whole disguising himself as her thing just makes the entire situation unsettling, to say the least. Thankfully, this whole weirdness sort of got explained when the Veronica virus was revealed to have been drawn from ant DNA, with Alexia poising herself as Queen of the Hive. So that whole sisterly love thing and the weird mannerisms makes a lot more sense with that sort of reveal, but it's still really odd just in general, so I really can't say that it gripped me as well as I think Capcom wanted it to. And while we're here talking plot, I might as well say that Albert Wesker is also in Code Veronica as a secondary antagonist, but I can only barely call him that. Albert's role in the plot is totally useless, and he doesn't affect what happens in any way whatsoever. It feels like Capcom only put him in the game here to have a tangible connection to his role in Resi 4, where he's trying to rebuild Umbrella with whatever data he can find on hand. It's because, for all of his cutscenes, all he does is just toss the main characters around for a bit, throw some punches, imitate the Matrix, and then leave of his own accord before murdering anybody he really, really hates. The final cutscene of the game, which is a fist fight between Chris and Albert, is laughably pathetic. The cutscene is shot in this really over-the-top action movie style with the striking angles and the camera work to emphasize the combat and all this assumed energeticness. But it's a useless venture when you realize before the cutscene that nothing and absolutely nothing Chris can do can actually hurt Albert. So all of these punches and all this fighting comes off like Chris is punching an aircraft carrier. The movements of Chris and Albert are weirdly slow and balletic, as they quote-unquote jump around the room, and the final comedy point is when the cutscene tried to make Chris pulling a winch to drop girders on Albert the climax of the cutscene. It doesn't work because the audience knows that Albert is immortal, so who the hell cares if he succeeds in dropping 400 pounds of steel on him? It didn't stop him for even a flippin' second. And just to top off this useless portrayal entirely, the new voice actor they got for Albert is the worst one he's ever had. The guy is only barely trying to do Albert's stupidly evil accent, and can't even get his shtick correctly done.
You have no idea how much I hate you. You destroyed my plans, so now I've sold my soul to a new organization. Now, die.
The voice acting sounds very forced and artificial when the true glory of Albert Wesker is that he is this Saturday morning cartoon villain, but he owns that fact and tries to make it legitimate, and it just comes off as totally charming. So whoever this bro is who is doing a hack job of getting it right is only drowning the concept altogether and making it completely backfire. He's not a bad voice actor, but he's a bad choice for this character specifically. The true tragedy about Code Veronica is that while it did commit to going beyond normal Resi tradition to get to this strange destination that it finds itself, but all of that effort ended up not helping the game at all. The problem is that all of this weirdness and bizarro logic has no payoff. I can't get super interested in Alexia and Alfred as villains because they don't seem to have a plan beyond regaining their honor and ruling the world like I could with Count Bleck, for example. And it seems that is the case because there aren't a lot of character building scenes with Alexia and Alfred, and the ones that they do have just make them look like oddballs to the nth degree, which I really can't connect with as a game player. A good example of the game thinking that just having weird things will make the game better is definitely the entire Antarctic mining facility. There is very little reason why this place was built and what purpose it was serving other than a front by Alexander to disguise his failed experiments. On top of all the zombie miners and the moths, the Antarctic facility houses a grand total of 3 BOW, Nosferatu, that giant spider, and Alexia herself. Speaking of Alexia, When she did get released ahead of schedule by Alfred, I was laughing at the cutscene because it showed that apparently Alfred is such an unknowable badass that he survived getting shot by Steve 4 times, falling down a 100-foot pit of ice, and then being able to crawl to Alexia's chamber and open it himself. That guy should have gone into wrestling or something if he could have survived all that bullshit. Now, don't get me wrong from all this criticism and stuff. Code Veronica is definitely a good game. If you're a fan of survival horror, you'll not go wrong in revisiting this weird spin-off, but the difference between it and, let's just say, for example, Resi 2, is that in Leon and Claire's Adventure, the game was a bit out of the norm for video games in general, but all the different set pieces, puzzles, and characters fit together really well into this tightly connected story, whereas Veronica has a similar quality design parts in it. It's just that they don't really all fit together that well, and their relative oddness to each other just has too many bits of the game fighting for the spotlight, and it ends up muddying the whole affair. The gameplay is your standard Resi affair with the tank control shooting and doing the puzzles through menus, having to manage your inventory and gather all the lore. At this point it's patented by Capcom, and it does bring a lot of unique puzzling bits to the table that'll stand out from the crowd, like that puzzle that could kill you with a drop weight trap, and the boss fight with Nosferatu where Capcom dabbled with sniping gameplay of all things. But there's no really big part of the gameplay to really comment on by itself, and it feels like the sprinkles put on top of the cupcake. Yeah, the puzzles and boss fights are there, but they don't really merit close examination. Code Veronica, for all of its faults, is an odd duck that decided to go with an odd premise in switching from Umbrella Inc. to the Ashford family in terms of an antagonist that didn't really help out the game out overall. The antagonists fold so easily under pressure, and since there's only 2 of them total, it doesn't feel like the protagonists are facing the long odds of other games, which means that I didn't get super invested or immersed into the story of the game. And since the gameplay itself is so stock and barrel from the original trilogy, that even the great gameplay really can't save the game from its faults. The 2 locations they picked are meticulously designed and interesting enough to explore. It's just not the Spencer Mansion, which put you in a relationship with the location due to the necessary constant backtracking. So you really got to know the interior inside and out by the end, which you just don't with Veronica. The lore of the game is a good read for a single game, but other than the advancement of the Veronica virus and the recurring characters, there is very little from Veronica that's going to live on in other titles of the series. The gameplay is still fun, challenging, and satisfying in employing the age-old Resi formula and just, at this point, adding bells and whistles onto it. But in spite of all the good things that Code Veronica manages and the new cinematics that the X re-release had, the game doesn't do all that much to stand out from the pack, and while it may be the loudest of all the spin-offs, it's still far from getting in that line with the original trilogy. I recommend the game because it is still quality survival horror with a lot to show off, but with the concepts that Capcom was throwing out with all this crazy psychoness for the creative opportunity, I just wish they had committed to it harder and added more details and story cutscenes to the game to make it really pop off the screen. With Code Veronica as it stands, it feels like they had these good ideas, but just didn't spend the time to really develop them into a legitimate showstopper title. It's kind of a shame, really, because this could have easily been the spin-off to beat out all main entries if it were developed differently. But as it stands, I guess at the end of the day, we'll just end the video by throwing up a scoreboard. And give you guys that final victory for gamers. Thanks for watching.